The interview is being virtually conducted and recorded. I am interviewing veterans named Howard Hadley, who was born on September 30th, 1945 in Baltimore, Maryland, and served in the Vietnam War between 1963 and 1989. Hadley was a Chief Master Sergeant in the branch of Air Force and served as a jet engine mechanic. This interview is sponsored by the Bell Tower Memorial. What was your education experience like before you entered the war?
Well, before I entered the service, I'll give you a little background. I was in a military family. My dad was U.S. Army, served in the Pacific, was a hero. He had a couple of really nice medals, but he never talked about the service. And he was a very strict father. I mean, discipline back in World War II, discipline was key. So he enforced discipline on us kids. I had 5 brothers and a sister. My 4 younger brothers were directed to join the service. Dad said, "You're going in the service. We're a patriotic family." My older brother went into the Air Force on his own, and then I joined the Air Force a couple of years later, or a year later. And my 2 younger brothers went into the Marine Corps. So we all went directly out of high school. So when we reached 17, we joined the service, enlisted. So prior to that, education was high school and a lot of little activities around the house, neighborhood, some summer vacation. But otherwise, we went into the service without a lot of experience other than the United States. Okay. Now, joining the service, I said my dad was a disciplinarian. So when you join the service, you go through basic training. And the Air Force basic training wasn't quite as stringent as some of the other services like the Marines. But going into Air Force basic, I'd have a drill instructor get up in my face and scream and yell at me. And I thought that was easy compared to what my dad did. So I had no problem at all going through basic training. In fact, I excelled at that. In fact, I became one of the leaders of our squadron, during the marching, because I knew it. I had experience in that. And then from basic training, I went into technical schools. My aptitude said I was a good mechanic or an electrician, that kind of thing. So you go into a field that pertains to that. Well, I went into jet mechanic schools, and the schools lasted about a year for different airplane engines, jet engines. From there, I was assigned to Vietnam. And Vietnam, actually, it was in 1968 through 72 that I had some Vietnam experience. I was assigned to an engine shop at Da Nang Air Base, Vietnam. We had rocket attacks. We had combat going on around us. But I was lucky. I'd go jump in a bunker whenever a rocket came near. But I lived in a tent for the first week. And then after that, I moved into a barracks. So I served as a crew chief, a jet engine mechanic in Vietnam. And I looked up one day and I saw this big cargo jet flying overhead, bringing supplies and whatever. And here's a representation of the cargo jet. It's a C-141 Starlifter, big 4-engine jet. So I looked up and I said, why am I turning wrenches on the ground when I could be up in the air flying as a crew member? So after about 6 months, my ground tour in Vietnam was up. So I transferred over to the flying field. So again, back to school, another almost 7-8 months of school, learning how to work on airplane engines. Not work on them, but see how they operate, because a flight engineer's duty is to sit in the cockpit, the flight station, and monitor all the systems, the electronics, the hydraulics, the oxygen, those kind of systems to make sure the plane was operating okay. And we'd sit behind the pilots, sometimes sit between the pilots, and flew all over the country. Well, with the C-141, that's the same airplane that brought the hostages, same type of plane that brought the hostages back from Vietnam. in the early years. The Hanoi Taxi, they called one of the planes. But I flew there in and out of Vietnam quite a bit on that aircraft. We did a lot of humanitarian missions. In other words, the airplane was configured so that it had stretchers, doctors and nurses, and we'd go into places like Cam Ranh Bay, Vietnam, Da Nang, even some places in Thailand, and we'd bring back wounded service members. Some of them were in critical condition. I'll try to limit what I think about that because I'll start bawling. Very emotional experience. Some of them, I went back in the back of the plane and talked to some of them, and one of them didn't make it, and that was hard. But as a crew member, I had a job to do, so I did that. And then a couple different missions went on also out of Vietnam. Near the end of the war in '73, we brought back children, babies. In fact, we called the mission Operation Baby Lift. We actually had an empty cargo airplane. We'd loaded up with boxes. Each box had a child in it. There were some 7-year-old children, refugees, orphans that would sit along the side with all the boxes in the middle. We couldn't tie them down each box, so we put a strap across all the boxes. So every box had a baby in it. We brought them out of Vietnam from Saigon out to the Philippines and to Guam, and then from Guam to Hawaii back to the United States. So all these children we saved, and I probably had 700 on the various missions total that we brought back to the United States. The parents, unfortunately, couldn't come back with us. And that was really sad because they handed their children over to us to save their lives. They didn't make it. They were either killed or sent into labor camps. Trying to tell people you can't get on the airplane is a hard thing to do, particularly when they know if they stay, they won't make it. So we did a bunch of those missions. And then I flew all over the country with the Starlifter, the 141, all over the world. I've been to some exotic places like Kathmandu, Nepal. And to tell you it's a small world, I took a train trip out to California. And on the train, of course, it was a long 2.5-day trip. In the dining car, I sat at the same table as a mother and son. And they were from Kathmandu, Nepal. Talk about a small world. And we chatted, and I told them things, and they told me things, and that was amazing. But the orphan issue, I was at a military funeral several years ago, and I was talking to some other veterans about Operation Baby Lift, and it was also called New Life, Operation Baby Lift and New Life. And I was talking to a veteran, and a lady came up to me, I would say 35, 40 years old, and hugged me and said she was an orphan that was on one of the flights. I mean, we hugged, and I probably cried with her for 15 minutes. She may not have been on my plane, but she was on a plane that brought her back. So small world again.
Yeah. What were you doing before you enlisted in the war?
I was operating as a jet mechanic through the Air Force, and I had enlisted in '63. So my training didn't start. I didn't actually start working as a mechanic until '64. So the war didn't start for me until 1968. So that's how I got into the beginning.
Can you tell me about the early weeks of your training?
The early weeks of the training, again, like I say, were technical schools. Basic training, learning different systems, hydraulics, with simulators that showed me how all the systems worked. And as a flight engineer, you had to know whatever your valve did, whatever your pump did, you had to know that, because as you're flying, something goes wrong, you need to pinpoint what it is so you can run an appropriate checklist to fix it. So, if you didn't, you could lose an engine or two engines, or you could go to something worse. But engineers had to know the systems without looking it up in a book. So it's
Yeah.
a subject. You need to know your subject. So I did that for the Star Lifter and later to the AWACS. I'll talk
Um,
about AWACS in a moment.
what was the best and worst food in the Air Force and why? Did you have any really awful food?
I never had a bad meal. Okay, well, that's a safe thing to say. I never had a bad meal. Breakfast was a challenge because in the service for breakfast they had one staple. It was called SOS, and what that stands for is sauce on a shingle. That's the safe way to say it. But it was like a meat sauce with like a sausage and meat white sauce on toast. The shingle, of course, was toast. Uh, but the Air Force had a little bit better accommodations than the other services. Uh, we had really good meals. We'd have steak uh, maybe once a week. We'd have very good meals compared to some of the other services. I think the Navy probably came second in the kind of food they had. We didn't have what the other services uh, called rations, K rations or meals that came in a box or cans or whatever. Of course, when you're in combat, you don't have the luxury of going to someplace nice to eat. You have to open a can and hope you can get it down before something happens. So the food was generally just like restaurant food. So I had a very good time with that. But some of the more interesting items of food were things that I'd eaten off base at some of the places like the Philippines. I went to jungle survival school. As a crew member, you'd have to go to a survival school in case you got shot down in near the jungles or whatever. And I remember catching a snake with a friend. I didn't kill it, but
Wow.
I killed a snake, and we skinned it and we ate snake. Now there's so many poisonous snakes you never know if they bit you, you'd be their food, but you catch them first. And I've things on a stick that I'm not sure what they were, like a shish kebab with, what the potatoes or the tubers were on the stick, but the meat, as long as it didn't have a tail, and it was probably edible, had some interesting meals. But throughout my flying around the world, I've eaten in German, Spanish. I've even had some Russian equivalents. But for the most part, it was good food. It was healthy, and as I say in a restaurant when I go out to eat somewhere, if the food is passable, the server will say, "Well, how was it?" I said, "Well, it was nutritious." Everybody says, "Oh yeah, it was fine." Well, no, it was nutritious.
Do you remember any unusual events that happened? And if so, what happened?
Unusual events, well, putting it into technical basis, the most unusual was having an emergency in the airplane.
Mhm.
The nose wheels wouldn't come down on their own. Those kind of things got you a little upset, nervous, whatever. But you have procedures to follow. I mean, there were never any things that I felt put my life in danger. I mean, there was never a time that I was thinking I was going to crash or get rocket attacks, killed by that kind of thing. I never worried about that. I had a job to do. And if you worry about what could happen to you, then you're not going to focus on your job. And I'll add one thing about that. My training, to back up a little bit, not only did my training include the Starlifter airplane, it also included AWACS, and that stands for AWACS, which is Airborne Warning and Control System. It's basically this airplane. Now, this is an AWACS. You notice the big dome on the top, and that was a big radar plane. And we flew those, probably 4 years I flew those. And those were basically a radar or air traffic control station in the sky. It would also go out throughout the world, like Poland and around Iceland, and look around to see what was going on. I mean, if we saw a threat, something dangerous, we could be like air traffic control and call some fighter planes over to help us. We didn't have any, these were defensive airplanes, not offensive. So we didn't have weapons or anything. We'd go out and look, and you could actually see cars on the highway and people walking. I mean, the range of these things was amazing without going into detail. But that was the other plane, and that was a little more challenging in the technical aspect because there were a lot more systems you had to worry about, you had to know about. So that was the other one.
So going back to the plane, when you were stationed in Washington, did you have any like relief when you were like you flew over Mount St. Helens after it or before it erupted?
Well, that was an interesting, when you fly out of McCord Air Force Base, you fly around Mount St. Helens to go out to the Pacific, at least you used to. And we flew over one day and there was a little smoke coming out of it. We didn't really worry about it because we've done that for almost a year, taking off and flying around and then heading out to the Pacific. Well, had we been delayed by one day, we probably would have been in the area when St. Helens blew up. And that could have been a major disaster. Even though they warned that it was dangerous, I mean, we were flying 10, 15,000 feet to get out of there. So we didn't concern ourselves with it. There, though, we would have probably been in the middle of the eruption. So that was something that could have been a disaster, but it turned out all right for us, not for the people on the ground.
So I understand you were a really disciplined kid with your father. Did that create better relationships with your officers?
Yes, discipline was the key. And there were I've met a lot of officers in my career, in my 25 and a half year career, anywhere from second lieutenants, which are the starting point, all the way through 4-star generals. And my goal was always to treat an officer with respect. I mean, I didn't necessarily agree with them, but they were my superior officers. Whenever they had some orders that were questionable, we'd discuss it. You know, I'd follow orders, but I had a moral code. You know, there's the letter of the law and there's the spirit of the law. And I tried to impress that on some of the younger officers. In a flight crew, you have 3 officers, 2 enlisted, and then of course, depending on the airplane, how many more officers. But it was a team. I mean, we didn't use first name basis. I'd say pilot, co-pilot, navigator. I'd use sir quite a bit, and I still do that. But the discipline, yes, you have rules, codes of conduct, and I expected everyone that worked for me, and I finally made Chief Master Sergeant, and I had probably 300 people working for me directly. I expected discipline, code of conduct, and respect for everyone appointed over them. And the ones underneath me, I was an uncommissioned officer. So I expected my people to follow the same rules. So I wasn't on first name basis with officers, and that breaks down the codes. Even though at some social events, I'd have a 4-star general tell me, Howard, what do you think about this? And I'd say, well, sir, you know, that kind of thing. Even though he said, no, call me Bill. I said, yes, sir, Bill. So I think discipline is extremely important. And I learned that in the service.
Did you keep a diary with you? And if so, what did you write about?
Well, I kept flight logs. In other words, the number of hours that I flew, the missions I flew. I kept some detailed logs. Of course, we went to some places where that was prohibited, some secret locations that we couldn't write about. We couldn't take pictures. But I kept a general log. And then in the last year or so, I've been working on my memoirs. In fact, I've completed that. And it's a story of basically my life up to about just after COVID. So I have pictures, and it's certainly doesn't contain any secrets, even though I think the code of the statute of limitations has probably run out on some of the places that I've been. So I try to keep that objective and truthful. And I think one of the big things besides discipline is the truth. I mean, if you tell the truth, you may not always get the answers you wanted, but at least you have personal integrity. Integrity is a big thing with me. So hope that answers your question.
Yeah. So I understand you were in the Air Force for a long time. Did you have any funny stories you experienced?
I'll tell you one story. We had a mission out to Easter Island. Now that's an island 2,000 miles west of Santiago, Chile.
Mhm.
And before any of these missions, you have a briefing. Well, one co-pilot didn't attend the briefing, and they told him what you can do, what you can bring with you, and what kind of souvenirs you can take. Well, the one co-pilot didn't show up at the briefing, and later he asked me. I saw him after the briefing. He came up late. He said, "What can I take to trade for some of the souvenirs?" And Easter Island, they didn't have a currency system. Very few
Mhm.
planes went in and out of there, so it was a barter system with them. So I told the co-pilot, I said, you know, they're indigenous peoples. Bring a bunch of beads, beads and things like Mardi Gras wreaths, things like that, and you can trade those for souvenirs. Like I had a couple of wooden statues that I saw that I wanted. Well, they really wanted, if he'd have been to the briefing, he'd have known they wanted old clothes. They didn't want beads and bangles, old clothes, jeans, shirts, that kind of thing, because they couldn't get those. They didn't have the capability to make those. So we got over to Easter Island, and we were there for 2 days. And we came up and we saw souvenirs that we wanted. And I gave a pair of jeans, got a souvenir. And the co-pilot hands all these beads over to one of the people and said, "I'd like that." And the guy looked at him and he said, "What do you think we are, natives? This isn't the Americas when the conquerors came over. You don't woo them with beads." So they refused to give him anything. And I said, "Okay, I had some extra clothes, so I gave him some clothes, and he got his souvenir, but he wasn't very happy with me. But then he missed the briefing. So uh, later that day, we did a tour of a volcano on Easter Island. I had an old bus, rickety bus, that took us around the volcano. And we stopped at one point that used to be for sacrifices in the early days of Easter Island. Uh, and and I asked one of the guides, I said, "What do you think about our co-pilot here?" He said, "Well, I'd throw him in the volcano if I could, but they wouldn't be very happy with us." That was kind of an interesting thing for him. And later we made up and had a good thing. But I'll tell you one other experience I had was in Egypt. We had flown the AWACS, the radar plane, over to Egypt for some training, set up a base. And during a day off, we had some civilians aboard with us that were called logistics officers, quote, logistics officer. They were more than that, but that's what I can tell you they were. And the one gal with me, she said, "Let's go see the pyramids." And we had a day off, so we got a cab, took us out to the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza. And we go out to there, and there's a bunch of camels around the base of the pyramid for the tourists to ride. Well, the camels had little decorations all over them. And the lady with me was said, we'll get a camel ride. So this one camel driver said, "Would you like to ride my beautiful camel?" And she looked at the camel and she said, "I'm not riding that filthy beast." Camel turned its head and spit a big wad of brown goo right all over her. It took 3 days for her to get back where she wasn't so mad at me, because I was on the ground laughing at her. It was so funny. But the camel, that wasn't a stupid camel. And I camel ride, and she got her camel present. So that was one of the funnier things I've run into in my
So
trip.
towards the end of your service, after you left, how did it affect your social life after you came home?
When I came home, well, I'll tell you one thing. During the middle of my service, I came home from Vietnam on a leave. And this was the height of the anti-war protests in America. And I came through O'Hare. And if you remember the movie Airplane, where the captain goes running through the airport and he runs into all these Hare Krishnas and protesters. And when I came back, I came through a crowd of very active protesters, and I was wearing a uniform. The other services didn't recommend wearing a uniform, but I wore a uniform. And as I was coming through the airport, people were spitting at me, spit at an American serviceman's uniform, calling me a baby killer, and some very nasty language. And I just held my head up and went through and ignored them. But that little experience, that welcome home in that regard, really upset me. And I kept that for some 30, 35 years. That's something you don't soon forget when they treat you like that and here you serve the country. You know, I didn't kill babies, I saved babies. So you can imagine how I felt terrible. But back in April of 18, we went on a Stars and Stripes honor flight, and the welcome back was what I should have had the first time.
Yeah.
4,000 people in the airport screaming, cheering, and welcoming me home. You know, I didn't know a single one in the airport, but 4,000 people knew me. And that kind of experience wiped away all the pain that I went through.
Awesome.
And when I got out of the service, to get back to your main point, when I got out of the service, I didn't stay around military bases. I lived all over the country, went to Miami and flew for Eastern Airlines. So I never had a close association with the military after I retired until went on the honor flight here in Wisconsin, and then started meeting veterans. And then I was back in the family because I felt at home. I didn't feel at home just getting out of the service. And I did a couple of things, retail jobs, so working in computer stores, until I went to Eastern Airlines. So I was finally back in the family. And now I volunteer with the Stars and Stripes honor flight. And those things make me feel welcome again. Whenever I see a veteran, I'd certainly welcome them back too. So that's what I'm doing now with the military after I got out of the service.
I understand discipline and moral code were like a big part of your experience. Are there any other life lessons you experienced in the military service?
Yes. I grew up in a small town outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And a lot of connections with different types of people, different races, different ethnicities. We didn't have that. In the service, I found out that there are a lot of different people. I mean, there are a lot of different races, a lot of different ideas, a lot of differences. However, when you're in the service, you're all the same. I don't care what the color of your skin is or what you believe in, we're all the same. And traveling all over the world, I go into countries like Germany and wherever, and we're just different looks. We're the same people. We have the same ideals, the same goals. Those things I found out through my travels around the world are no different than your own neighborhood. And if you treat people the way you would expect them to treat you, then they will. The golden rule is a big factor there. So I don't care what their opinions are. They're entitled to their opinions. I mean, we fought so that people could have the right to free speech. It bothers me a little that people disregard those to their favor. I mean, putting flags upside down, things like that. They're certainly entitled to do that. They have every right. But I will let them know that I'm not pleased with it. But that's where it stops. Thank you for being a citizen, you know, and walk away. I don't provoke those kind of things, but then I don't tolerate a lot of it, but I don't provoke any reactions. They'll ask me, did you vote for this or that? I said, who I voted for is my business. I won't discuss it. So if you stay neutral and you don't involve yourself in these violent groups, then you'll probably have a better life, especially at the end.
Yeah.
So those things I learned, that everybody's equal. Discipline is a key role, and it should apply to everyone from high school kids, elementary, whatever, all the way up through college. Discipline will get you where you want to go. And if you have a dream, you got to pursue your dream. I pursued mine, and I'm where I want to be right now. So those things, yes, they're very important life lessons, if you will.
Yeah, so I was doing some research on the Vietnam War. I came across Operation Baby Lift. Is there anything else you wanted to let students know about the Vietnam War?
Vietnam War was another war in a series of wars. I mean, I didn't start it. We didn't finish it. We followed orders. We did our jobs. And our goal was freedom, freedom for our country, freedom for their country. It didn't quite work out that way for their country, but yes, we did what our leaders told us to do within reason to preserve freedom, to preserve democracy. And that's the big thing of the Vietnam War. We were fighting to preserve democracy and freedom. Things changed a little bit, but there were a lot of things committed during the war that I don't think we were proud of, but we had jobs to do. We followed orders and let the leaders, let the government make the decisions, and we would carry them out. That was a discipline following orders, but not to the point where it would violate our own moral principles.
So when you came back to the U.S., what kind of jobs did you have? Because I understand like you weren't with the military anymore.
No, I ran a computer store right in Brookfield for 7 years. We had a previous manager that was not quite a manager, so I ended up managing the store and running the store. From there, I did a couple other occupational jobs like driving school buses. So a little variety throughout there. I didn't drive school buses very long. When the kids are going crazy in the back of the bus and throwing things at you, discipline was not the key there. I mean, I stopped the bus a few times and said, "Till you settle down, I'm going to sit here. I don't care if it takes 2 days." Well, eventually they settled down. But in our store, we had people that were shoplifters. Confront them. I mean, I'd call the police on them. I'll tell you one little quick story of the computer store in Brookfield. It was called Computer Renaissance. Well, I was the manager, so at 3 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from the Brookfield police that said, "There's been a break-in at your store." So I got dressed, ran out to the store, and there's 2 policemen waiting at the door. And they said, "You go ahead and go in and we'll follow you in." I said, "You're the police. If it's a break-in, you better go first." "No, we have regulations against them." I said, "Okay." So I went into the store. I'm looking around and I don't see anything out of place. So I walk back and they're right next to me. And I walk back into the back technical room, and this big rabbit jumped off a shelf, nearly gave me a heart attack. A big black and white rabbit. The thing must have been 300 pounds. Well, it was more like a couple of pounds, but when a rabbit jumps out of you towards your face, it's 300 pounds. So I was so nervous. I told the cops, "Shoot the rabbit, shoot the rabbit." And of course the cops said, "No, we have regulations in Brookfield, paragraph, da-da-da-da-da." I said, "Well, then shoot your buddy, shoot somebody, I'm scared to death." And after I settled down, I said, "Okay, well, call animal control and get them out of here." And they said, "Well, animal control doesn't work until 8 o'clock in the morning." And I said, "Well, the rabbit got to get out of here, or we're going to keep getting these alarms." And I asked one of the policemen, "Please grab the rabbit, take it out the back door." Said, "No, we can't touch it. It's regulation 14, paragraph, whatever, all this." And I said, "Okay." And I just went over and grabbed the rabbit by the scruff of his neck, opened the back door and turned him loose. Apparently when I was putting the trash out for the night, I left the door open and it wandered in and climbed into the store. But that was one of the few occasions I've had that nearly did me in. I mean, the service was a piece of cake compared to a rabbit at your throat, 300-pound rabbit. So that was one of the interesting things. And with flying with Eastern Airline, in Florida, we saw some things that were unexplainable, like flying between Miami and Atlanta. You'd go out over near the Bermuda Triangle, that kind of thing. And there were some things that that basically were unexplainable, lights and different things. And the policy of the airline was you do not report UFOs. Even though we took documentation, we called the radar stations and said, hey, you know, this is unexplained. Do you have something on your radar? No, we have nothing on radar. We see nothing. Kind of like Hogan's Heroes. I see nothing. But yes, we had some interesting experiences, and we knew what it was, or we thought we knew what it was, but
Oh,
toward that, they think you were off your rocker. That was
unfortunately, our time is up. So in closing, this has been an interview of Howard Hadley regarding his service during the Vietnam War. My name is Drew Sonderman. The time is 9:36, and thank you for agreeing to this interview. And most importantly, thank you for your service. It really, really means a lot to me. And I think a lot of people do take it for granted.
Well, Drew, I appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences. And I think those that see this will understand some of the things I'm trying to say. And I wish you all a good career. Go for your dreams.